police files, René was never written in full. He was always R.VH. That alone told experienced detectives something important. Initials were reserved for men who were dangerous, connected, and legally sensitive. René was already known long before he became visible. René grew up in a Dutch industrial town where warehouses mattered more than schools. Trucks came and went at night. Adults spoke in code. Children learned early not to ask questions. Crime wasn't glamorous, it was routine. His home was quiet, not peaceful. Arguments happened behind closed doors. Money appeared suddenly, then vanished. René learned early that silence kept families alive. René admired men who didn't panic, men who spoke softly and got results. Many of them later appeared in police files linked to smuggling rings and cash transport networks. He left school early, but didn't drift. By 16, he was already useful, moving packages, guarding vehicles, memorizing routes. He wasn't a fighter, he was a logistics mind. Older criminals taught René that routes were more important than products. If you control movement, you control profit. That lesson shaped his entire criminal life. Police later linked René to false cargo documentation used to hide contraband among legitimate shipments. It was a non-violent crime, but highly strategic. René never led. He attached himself to men connected to Brabant crime groups that later intersected with Klaas Bruinsma's extended network. Between ages 19 and 25, René spent most nights in warehouses. Cocaine was hidden in machinery, hash shipments moved through fruit containers. René kept inventories, never touching product directly. A phone number appeared repeatedly in different investigations. René wasn't arrested, but his number was everywhere. That made him interesting. René avoided street violence. He believed violence attracted attention. Others did the hitting. René made sure they were paid. Although not a patched member, René worked through Hell's Angels and later Satudara-linked facilitators, using them for intimidation and debt enforcement. René was linked to cash-heavy businesses, car washes, snack bars, transport companies, used to clean money from drug sales. When Klaas Bruinsma was killed, René learned a critical lesson. Visibility kills. He became even quieter after that. René's name surfaced indirectly in cases involving Willem Holleder's extortion era, mainly as a background facilitator, not an enforcer. Witnesses described a calm logistics man, but never gave a name. René never met debtors, he met planners. By the late 1990s, René's operations touched Belgium, Germany, and Spain, especially through trucking companies. Court summaries later connected his networks to cocaine, hashish, and synthetic drug precursors. Always indirect, always layered. René mastered fake tenders, shipping contracts, and subcontracting, making criminal cargo look legal on paper. Warehouses were raided, drivers were arrested. René was never present. That pattern frustrated investigators deeply. Authorities seized several €100,000 from an associated company. René himself wasn't charged, but the money trail pointed toward him. As port security increased, René shifted inland, storage, repackaging, and redistribution hubs far from harbors. He avoided impulsive killers and addicts. René believed instability destroyed networks. Many shipments used Eastern European drivers who never met René directly. If caught, they knew nothing useful. Among criminals, René was described as safe. Among police, he was described as slippery. Several cases mentioned René's initials followed by that phrase. It haunted investigators. As ecstasy labs expanded in Brabant, René facilitated chemical sourcing and transport, not production. During violent underworld conflicts, René stayed untouched because he didn't pick sides publicly. René avoided photos, celebrations, and funerals. Visibility was weakness. By his 40s, René had already begun fading from active operations, training others, stepping back, leaving fingerprints nowhere. René understood that survival meant distance. He began training younger men to handle day-to-day logistics. These men never met each other fully. Each knew only one piece of the chain. René stayed above it all. As ecstasy labs multiplied in Brabant, René became involved indirectly. He didn't cook drugs. He arranged chemical deliveries, waste removal, and transport, services labs couldn't survive without. One of René's darkest involvements was waste dumping. Toxic chemical waste from drug labs was illegally disposed of in forests and industrial zones. Police suspected René coordinated transport contracts for these operations. Investigators noticed René's network brushing against figures linked to Bruinsma's old lieutenants, early Holiday-era extortion circles, and later Brabant syndicates that fed into Mokro-style logistics. René rotated phones weekly, often using phones registered to dead people or foreign nationals. He never discussed crimes directly, only delivery times and documents. Several trucks tied to René were stopped near Antwerp. Drugs were found, but René's name appeared nowhere. Belgian police flagged his initials anyway. René believed touching drugs made you vulnerable. If arrested, you couldn't deny involvement. He handled paper, schedules, and money flow, never the goods. An accountant who managed shell companies connected to René vanished suddenly. Police suspected intimidation, but no proof ever surfaced. A driver was assaulted after skimming profits. René didn't retaliate publicly. The driver later lost all contracts and left the country. Silent punishment. Funds moved through car export businesses, transport firms, and small construction companies. Everything looked legitimate on paper. Every operation had buffers. René never signed contracts himself. Everything went through proxies. René wasn't a biker, but he used Hells Angels-linked transport firms and later Satudara-connected enforcers for protection and debt pressure. Police raided a warehouse minutes after René left. Cameras caught only his silhouette. The footage became legendary inside the investigation unit. The killing of Willem Enstra reinforced René's belief: money makes you visible. He scaled back personal wealth displays immediately. When underworld violence escalated years later, René deliberately exited active drug movement. He saw chaos as bad business. René transitioned into advising, helping others structure smuggling routes and laundering systems. Internal reports stopped calling him a trafficker. Instead, he was labeled strategic facilitator, a harder crime to prosecute. Several informants described a bald logistics man with initials R.V.H. None had direct evidence. René knew where bodies were metaphorically buried: roots, names, secrets. That knowledge protected him. Criminals didn't fear René's violence, they feared his memory. If you crossed him, opportunities vanished quietly. He cut off childhood friends who became reckless. Survival required emotional coldness. After years without arrest, René became a low priority. That was his greatest victory. He coordinated movements between the Netherlands, Germany, and Spain, especially return routes to avoid empty trucks. René never accepted formal leadership. Leaders attract bullets and wiretaps. No public violence, no threats to families, no impulsive acts. Anyone breaking these rules was removed. He paid fair and on time. In the underworld, that built stronger loyalty than fear. New generations saw René as a blueprint for clean crime, organized, quiet, and strategic. Even decades later, René's initials resurface in unresolved investigations. By his late 40s, René barely appeared anywhere physically. He operated through 2 layers of intermediaries. His last suspected involvement concerned precursor chemicals, not finished drugs, keeping his exposure minimal. René didn't retire, he faded. Criminals noticed he was no longer available. His file was never closed, just dormant. He lived modestly, drove normal cars, avoided nightlife. René didn't owe money, didn't betray allies, and didn't show power publicly. He lived isolated. No friends, no celebrations, Not drugs, not money laundering, but enabling entire systems that destroyed communities. Investigators believe René prevented dozens of arrests by structuring crime efficiently. Because there's no single moment, no arrest photo, no dramatic fall, René never made front pages. That was intentional. In police archives, his file remains marked with one sentence: highly intelligent facilitator, extreme caution advised. As Dutch police reopened historic files, René's initials quietly resurfaced alongside old underworld names like Garrett.G.V, Brunsma-era transporters, and men once connected to André Brilleman. Nothing was provable, but the patterns were familiar. Although René never worked directly under Class Brunsma, his logistics model mirrored Brunsma's old structure. Police believed René learned from men who survived that era and adapted the system without the ego. Certain transport routes through Limburg and North Brabant were avoided by rival criminals. René's influence made those routes quiet zones. Anyone interfering risked consequences that came later and quietly. René preferred clean drivers, men with no records. They believed they were hauling industrial materials. Plausible deniability was his strongest weapon. When encrypted phones became popular, René avoided them. He believed technology created trails. Instead, he returned to handwritten codes and face-to-face meetings. Police once surveilled a hotel where René was rumored to meet men linked to Willem Holliday's old circle. René never showed. Later, it was revealed the meeting was moved twice at the last minute. Witnesses who knew René's role had nothing concrete. He never threatened them. He never paid them directly. There was nothing to testify about. Investigators concluded René's greatest crime wasn't drugs, but making drug crime efficient. He created stability where chaos should have existed. René never asked questions that mattered. He didn't want information he couldn't afford to know. This made informants useless. René coordinated movement between Brabant labs and Rotterdam export points using third-party shipping companies. He never appeared on any customs paperwork. Several illegal dumping sites discovered years later matched routes linked to René's transport companies. Environmental crimes became part of his legacy. Despite his crimes, René refused involvement in kidnappings or murders. Violence created heat. Heat destroyed systems. Two men connected to his logistics chain were shot years apart. Police believe they broke internal rules. René cut all ties immediately. For some, René's silence was worse than threats. Losing his trust meant losing income overnight. Belgian and German authorities exchanged notes mentioning R.H as a suspect facilitator. Still no arrest, no fingerprints, no intercepted calls, no financial links strong enough to hold in court. René lived alone. No celebrations, no visible friendships. Control isolated him completely. Newer criminals dismissed old discipline. René saw the underworld becoming reckless and dangerous. As Mokro-related violence escalated nationwide, René fully withdrew. He predicted chaos would attract massive law enforcement pressure. René could have earned more. Instead, he chose survival. His case was never closed, just waiting. René valued patience. The new generation valued speed. Speed made mistakes. Even in normal settings, René carried the weight of what he enabled: addiction, environmental damage, organized crime growth. He never spoke, never leaked, never appeared. Even criminals who hated facilitators admitted René was correct. Drivers arrested, labs busted, forests poisoned. René remained untouched, but not innocent. Some investigators admitted they might never arrest him. That truth was painful. In criminal circles, René's name became a lesson. Intelligence beats force. René didn't dominate with fear, he dominated with structure. A criminal who never needed a nickname. He didn't need one. A single letter was enough. By the early 2000s, René van H was no longer visible in active investigations, but his influence had not disappeared. Police noticed that drug routes, storage methods, and transport schedules still followed the same disciplined patterns they had seen years earlier. It was as if someone had written a manual and criminals were still following it. René's absence didn't mean his impact was gone. It meant his systems had become independent. Even when René was not directly involved, groups connected to Brabant, Limburg, and cross-border logistics operated with unusual order. Loads arrived on time, payments were structured, mistakes were rare. Investigators suspected these networks were built on foundations René had helped design years before. René was known for one thing above all else: structure. He taught people to separate roles. Drivers never met suppliers. Warehouse guards never knew owners. That blueprint survived him. Criminals copied it because it worked. A new generation of traffickers didn't know René personally. They only knew the rules he left behind. Never talk, never rush, never brag. In interviews, police heard the same phrases repeated, phrases first associated with René's circle. René believed violence attracted attention. His operations focused on efficiency, not fear. That's why areas under his influence saw fewer public shootings compared to rival groups tied to impulsive leaders. René understood that silence wasn't just protection, it was power. By never speaking, even casually, he denied police the small details they used to build cases. Years later, that silence still protected others. René didn't hide people physically, he hid them administratively, using layers of intermediaries, legal businesses, and indirect ownership structures. This made it almost impossible to prove responsibility. Although René rarely touched drugs himself, his logistics made large-scale trafficking possible. Cocaine, synthetic drugs, and chemicals moved faster and farther, increasing addiction and environmental harm. Dutch authorities slowly realized that men like René were more dangerous than street dealers. Facilitators controlled flow, not corners. René became a case study in police training, even without a conviction. René's name remained in intelligence databases for decades. Each new case added another indirect reference. No proof, but no deletion either. Certain industrial zones near the Belgian and German borders remained consistently active in drug logistics. Police believed these corridors had been mapped and normalized during René's most active years. René didn't intimidate rivals. Instead, he offered stability. Fighting him meant disrupting profitable routes, something most gangs preferred to avoid. Officially, René faded from the scene. Unofficially, investigators suspected he transitioned into advisory roles, connecting people without appearing in transactions. René insisted that no place be used twice. Cafes, rest stops, hotels, each meeting location was disposable. This erased patterns police rely on. Authorities attempted to pressure René through tax investigations. They found nothing. He owned little, earned little on paper, and kept assets outside obvious channels. René never lived extravagantly. He believed wealth attracted scrutiny. His real value lay in access to people, routes, and timing. Several traffickers avoided prosecution simply because René ensured their names never appeared in records. They existed only as shadows. René avoided close friendships inside crime. Loyalty to him was procedural, not emotional. This prevented betrayal fueled by jealousy or fear. One detective came close by tracing transport permits and warehouse rentals, but every trail ended legally, ownership transferred years earlier. Facilitating crime without touching drugs remained difficult to prosecute. René built his entire career inside that gray zone. Later waves of gang violence shocked the Netherlands. Police noted these newer groups lacked the discipline René enforced. According to informants, René viewed newer gang leaders as reckless, too loud, too emotional, too careless. Several informants claimed René was behind everything, yet none could provide proof. He was always one step removed. To René, crime was paperwork, schedules, and logistics, not adrenaline. That mindset made him dangerous. René avoided phones, cameras, and routines. Without recordings, cases collapsed before trial. By the time investigators began seriously focusing on René van H, he was no longer viewed as a peripheral figure or a background facilitator. According to Dutch law enforcement intelligence, this phase marked the moment René crossed a psychological and into commitment. Officers reviewing years of surveillance logs noted that his behavior shifted dramatically. He no longer merely appeared near criminal events, he began to shape them. Meetings happened more frequently, locations changed often, and communication patterns grew more disciplined. This was not the behavior of someone dabbling. This was the posture of someone who understood the risks and accepted them. Intelligence analysts believed René had reached a stage where withdrawal was no longer possible. According to confidential briefings, he had become a trusted intermediary between violent actors and financial backers. His role, as reconstructed later, was not to pull triggers, but to ensure that the machinery around those triggers functioned smoothly. He helped people meet without being seen. He moved information in fragments so no single person could expose the entire plan. This fragmentation of knowledge is a classic tactic in organized crime, and investigators were alarmed by how naturally René seemed to apply it. Police wiretaps reportedly captured moments where René spoke in half sentences, leaving critical details unspoken. Detectives interpreted this as experience, not paranoia. He understood that language itself could be evidence. One senior officer later stated that René spoke like someone who had already imagined the courtroom and planned how to survive it. This awareness separated him from reckless criminals. He was careful, structured, and patient. During this period, René was allegedly present in discussions involving extortion enforcement, debt recovery tied to drug shipments, and the management of conflict between rival groups. Names connected to outlaw motorcycle clubs, regional trafficking cells, and freelance enforcers surfaced repeatedly in intelligence summaries. René was not described as the loudest voice in the room, but he was often the final one. Witnesses later suggested that when René spoke, others listened, not because he threatened them, but because he carried information they needed. This phase also revealed his moral detachment. Investigators noted that René showed no visible reaction when discussions involved violence or long-term consequences. This emotional neutrality concerned psychologists consulted by law enforcement. It suggested someone who had compartmentalized guilt entirely, viewing criminal outcomes as abstract necessities rather than human events. In internal reports, this was described as operational numbness, a trait common among long-term facilitators. By the end of this stage, René van H was no longer just a name appearing in multiple case files. He had become a connective figure, someone whose removal could destabilize entire networks. That realization pushed authorities to elevate him from person of interest to strategic target, setting the stage for deeper surveillance and eventual intervention. As investigations deepened, one pattern became impossible to ignore. René van H did not belong to a single criminal organization in the traditional sense. According to intelligence sources, he operated in the space between groups, a dangerous position that required trust, discretion, and adaptability. This made him valuable, but it also made him vulnerable. One mistake could have cost him his life. The fact that he survived for so long indicated a high level of strategic intelligence. Police analysts described René as a bridge actor. He allegedly facilitated communication between outlaw motorcycle club figures, independent traffickers, and individuals linked to violent enforcement crews. These alliances were not permanent. They shifted depending on money flow, police pressure, and internal disputes. René's skill was knowing when to move and when to remain silent. Investigators believed he had an exceptional ability to read tension in rooms, recognizing when conversations were about to turn dangerous. During this phase, René was reportedly linked to meetings involving figures associated with well-known Dutch underworld circles. While he was never publicly identified as a member of any single gang, his repeated proximity to influential names raised serious concern. Surveillance logs showed him attending gatherings shortly before major criminal operations occurred. Drug shipments, coordinated intimidation campaigns, or sudden disappearances of rival figures. What made René particularly difficult to pin down was his lack of visible hierarchy. He did not command foot soldiers. He did not collect money personally. Instead, he functioned as an organizer, someone who ensured the right people were present, that misunderstandings were cleared, and that agreements held long enough to be profitable. According to police psychologists, this role often attracts individuals who prefer control over chaos, influence over attention. Investigators also noted that René avoided emotional entanglement. He did not socialize excessively, avoided alcohol during meetings, and rarely discussed personal matters. This created a professional distance that reduced leverage against him. In one intercepted exchange, a known criminal complained that René was impossible to read, a statement investigators interpreted as both frustration and respect. At this stage, René's criminal world was no longer defined by loyalty, but by utility. He worked with those who delivered results and cut off those who attracted unnecessary attention. This selective engagement helped him survive internal purges and law enforcement pressure. However, it also meant that when alliances collapsed, as they inevitably did, René often stood alone, carrying knowledge that others feared. Police files from this period repeatedly describe him as central but elusive, a phrase that would follow him for years. He was close enough to power to be dangerous, but distant enough to deny responsibility. That balance made him one of the most complex figures investigators faced. Behind every intelligence report and coded conversation lay consequences that rarely appeared in official summaries. Investigators later acknowledged that René van H's alleged actions had ripple effects far beyond financial crime. While he may not have committed violence personally, authorities believed his facilitation enabled it. This distinction mattered legally, but morally it blurred quickly. Victims of extortion linked to networks René allegedly interacted with described an atmosphere of constant fear. Businesses closed suddenly, families relocated without explanation, debts that began as financial disputes escalated into threats that felt impossible to escape. According to victim statements reviewed by investigators, the most frightening aspect was not the violence itself, but the inevitability, the sense that resistance was pointless because the system was too organized. Law enforcement psychologists argued that facilitators like René often inflict deeper damage than visible perpetrators. By keeping operations smooth and predictable, they allow violence to occur efficiently and quietly. One internal report stated, "The absence of chaos is what allows sustained harm." René's calm presence, his ability to stabilize criminal partnerships, allegedly contributed to this sustained harm. There were also personal consequences within the criminal world. Associates who fell out of favor often found themselves isolated overnight. Phone calls stopped. Support vanished. In some cases, this isolation preceded serious harm. Investigators believed René sometimes acted as a gatekeeper, not ordering punishment, but allowing it to happen by withdrawing protection or access. Families connected to the underworld felt his influence indirectly. A former associate reportedly told police that René's greatest weapon was not fear, but exclusion. Being cut off from the network meant vulnerability to rivals, debt collectors, and law enforcement simultaneously. This silent pressure destroyed lives without a single overt threat. By this stage, authorities no longer viewed René's role as passive. Even without blood on his hands, his alleged influence shaped outcomes that caused lasting trauma. This realization reframed the investigation. The question was no longer what crimes did he commit, but how many crimes were possible because he existed in that role. That understanding hardened the resolve of prosecutors and investigators alike. René was no longer just a participant in the underworld. He was a structural component. Removing him, they believed, could weaken entire networks. That belief would drive the next phase of the case, where surveillance turned into preparation, and preparation edged toward confrontation. As René van H's influence quietly grew, investigators believed he entered a stage where survival became his main skill. This was no longer about ambition or money alone. It was about staying alive, staying free, and staying invisible. According to police files, René understood something many criminals learned too late. The most dangerous moment is not when you rise, but when people start noticing you. During this period, René allegedly changed the way he lived. He reduced public appearances, he avoided predictable routines, he stopped visiting places that could connect him too clearly to known criminals. People who once saw him often began to notice long gaps of absence. Investigators later described this as intentional disappearance, not a full escape, but a careful step back into the shadows. René did not cut ties completely. That would have raised suspicion. Instead, he became quieter. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, he used fewer words. Police believed he understood that every sentence could be repeated, recorded, or misunderstood, so he made sure there was less to repeat. According to intelligence sources, René relied heavily on indirect communication. Messages passed through trusted intermediaries. Information was delivered in pieces, never whole stories. This way, no one person could fully expose him. If someone was arrested, they could only tell part of the truth. This system protected René, but it also isolated him. People who once worked closely with him later told investigators that René seemed emotionally distant during this phase. He no longer laughed easily, he rarely shared opinions, conversations stayed short and focused. This emotional distance was not arrogance. Police psychologists believed it was self-protection. The less people knew about him personally, the less they could use against him. René also became extremely careful about trust. Investigators believed he tested people constantly, not with obvious traps, but with small changes in information. If details leaked, he quietly removed that person from his circle. No arguments, no confrontations, just silence. This silent removal was often more frightening than threats. At the same time, René allegedly continued to play a quiet but important role in criminal networks. He was still contacted when problems arose, still asked to help smooth conflicts, still trusted to keep secrets. This balance, being useful but unseen, was dangerous, but René seemed to manage it carefully. Police later wrote that René lived like someone who always expected the door to open suddenly. He was alert, he watched faces, he noticed changes in tone. Every interaction was treated as a possible risk. This constant alertness took a toll. Investigators believed René slept poorly and lived under permanent tension even if he never showed it. By the end of this stage, René van H was no longer chasing power, he was preserving position. He had learned that survival in the underworld does not belong to the loudest or the strongest, but to the one who knows when to step back before the spotlight burns. As René van H became quieter, law enforcement became louder. According to investigators, this period marked a turning point where pressure increased from every direction. Surveillance intensified. Files thickened. Separate investigations began pointing to the same name. René may have tried to disappear, but the system around him was slowly tightening. Police analysts began connecting patterns. Meetings that once seemed unrelated now formed a timeline. Phone numbers changed, but voices remained the same. Locations shifted, but the same faces appeared nearby. René was not caught doing one dramatic crime. Instead, he was caught being present too often at the wrong times around the wrong people. Investigators believed René understood this shift. His behavior suggested awareness. He became even more cautious. He avoided electronic communication whenever possible. When phones were used, conversations stayed vague. No names, no places, just hints. This made cases harder to build, but not impossible. Law enforcement also applied indirect pressure. Associates were questioned. Businesses connected to his circle were inspected. Financial movements were reviewed carefully. Even small inconsistencies were noted. The goal was not immediate arrest, but discomfort. Police wanted René to feel watched. According to internal reports, this strategy worked. René allegedly began making mistakes, small ones, but noticeable. Meetings were delayed. Messages were passed incorrectly. Trusted intermediaries hesitated. The smooth flow he once maintained started to slow. Investigators saw this as stress. At this stage, René was caught between two dangers: On one side was law enforcement, building cases slowly and quietly. On the other side was the criminal world, where suspicion grows quickly when someone becomes too careful. Silence, once a strength, can look like betrayal. Police believed René struggled with this balance. If he pulled back too much, criminal partners might see him as unreliable. If he stayed too involved, he risked exposure. This tension created cracks. Investigators focused on these cracks, hoping one would widen enough to reveal something solid. There were moments when arrests of others caused panic. Each arrest raised the question, who might talk? René reportedly responded by reducing contact even further. He did not panic publicly. He did not flee. He waited. This patience frustrated investigators, but it also confirmed their belief that René was experienced and dangerous in a quiet way. Law enforcement files from this period describe René as contained, not broken. He was under pressure, but not reckless. He did not confess. He did not cooperate. He did not lash out. He endured. This stage was not about capture yet. It was about endurance for both sides. Police pushed slowly. René resisted quietly. The confrontation was coming, but neither side rushed it. Eventually, time itself became René van H's enemy. Investigators often say that no criminal escapes consequences forever, not because of one big mistake, but because of accumulated choices. For René, this phase was when the past stopped staying buried. Old connections resurfaced. Former associates were arrested. Some faced long sentences. Under pressure, people talk. Even when they don't confess directly, they reveal patterns, habits, and structures. Police believed these fragments helped them understand René's role more clearly. René allegedly felt this shift. According to intelligence, he became more isolated than ever. Trusted figures were gone or compromised. New people were unreliable. The network that once protected him now felt thin. This isolation was dangerous. In the underworld, isolation often comes before downfall. At the same time, René had to live with the consequences of earlier decisions. People who had suffered financial loss, threats, or exclusion still remembered his involvement. Even if years had passed, resentment does not fade easily. Investigators believed René carried enemies he no longer remembered, but who remembered him clearly. This period also revealed the emotional cost of his life. René had no public family support, few visible friendships, no safe space outside the criminal world. Police psychologists noted that such long-term isolation often leads to exhaustion, paranoia, and emotional numbness. René's calm remained, but it was heavier. He was no longer building anything. He was defending what remained. Each day was about avoiding collapse rather than achieving control. This shift marked the true beginning of the end, even if it was not visible yet. Investigators believed René understood this on some level, not as regret, but as acceptance. Choices made years earlier could not be undone. He could only manage their consequences. This acceptance did not make him weaker, but it made him quieter. By this stage, René van H was no longer a rising figure or a hidden organizer. He was a man surrounded by the echoes of his past actions. Every deal, every silence, every indirect decision had shaped the world around him, and now that world was slowly turning back towards him. As time passed, René began to experience something he had avoided his entire life, the weight of his own silence. For years, silence had protected him. It had kept police guessing and criminals uncertain. But now, that same silence became heavy. According to investigators and people who once knew him, René was no longer just avoiding danger, he was carrying it. René had built his survival on not talking, not explaining, and not reacting. That strategy worked when he was active and useful, but as pressure increased and his circle shrank, silence stopped being a shield and started feeling like isolation. He could not explain himself to anyone. He could not ask for help. In the underworld, showing weakness invites destruction. People close to him later described a man who was constantly thinking. René was always alert, always listening, always calculating outcomes. Even small decisions felt dangerous. Where to sit, who to greet, who to ignore.
Every move was measured. This level of mental pressure slowly eats at a person. René reportedly slept very little. When he did sleep, it was shallow. Police psychologists explained that men who live long lives under threat often remain half awake even in rest. Their minds never fully shut down. René lived like a man expecting a knock on the door, not necessarily from police, but from consequences. At this stage, René's reputation worked against him. People assumed he was strong enough to handle everything. No one checked on him emotionally. No one asked how he was coping. Fear replaces concern in criminal environments. Respect does not come with support. According to sources, René started distancing himself even from neutral people, not because he disliked them, but because any connection could become a weakness. Relationships require honesty, and honesty was something René could not afford. This deepened his isolation. His past decisions also replayed in his mind, not with regret, but with awareness. He knew exactly how each choice had led him here, each alliance, each silence, each indirect decision. He understood that his life was the result of long-term patterns, not sudden mistakes. Despite this, René did not panic. Panic leads to sloppy behavior. He remained controlled, calm, still. But this calm was no longer confident. It was heavy, like a man holding his breath underwater for too long. Investigators noted that this phase often precedes collapse or confrontation. When a person becomes too isolated, they lose flexibility. René's silence had turned inward, and inward pressure is often the most dangerous kind. One of the hardest truths in organized crime is that no one is permanent. Power shifts, loyalty fades, younger men rise. René van H began to realize that the world he helped build no longer needed him the way it used to. New figures appeared. They were louder, faster, more reckless. They did not value silence the way René did. They valued speed, aggression, and visibility. Social media, encrypted messaging, and younger networks changed how crime operated. René's old methods still worked, but fewer people understood them. This created distance. Meetings stopped happening. Calls became rare. Decisions were made without him. René was not pushed out violently. He was slowly ignored. This quiet replacement hurt more than confrontation. In the underworld, being forgotten is worse than being feared. According to investigators, René noticed this shift early. He did not fight it. Fighting change in crime only accelerates destruction. Instead, he stepped further back, accepting that his role had ended. But stepping back does not erase history. New criminals still knew his name. Old enemies still remembered him. Police still watched him. Even without influence, René remained trapped by his past reputation. He had no clean exit. Younger criminals viewed him as outdated. Older ones viewed him as a risk. Law enforcement viewed him as unresolved. René existed in between, not active enough to arrest easily, not irrelevant enough to ignore. This stage was emotionally dangerous. Men in René's position often make fatal decisions, returning too fast, proving relevance, or trusting the wrong people. René did none of those things. He stayed still. He waited. Waiting was all he had left. But waiting comes with fear. The longer time passes, the more unpredictable outcomes become. René knew that at any moment a forgotten detail could resurface, a witness could speak, a file could reopen. He lived knowing the past was not finished with him. Investigators later described him as a man standing on a frozen lake listening for cracks. He didn't move because movement might break everything. The criminal world moved on without him, but it never truly let him go. When people speak about René van H today, they do not speak loudly. His name does not appear in flashy headlines or exaggerated legends. Instead, his story exists in files, whispers, and cautious conversations. That is his legacy. Quiet, controlled, and unsettling. René did not seek fame. He did not seek recognition. His power came from being unseen. But that same invisibility erased any chance of redemption.
There were no public apologies, no explanations, no clarifications, just absence. Police analysts often describe René as an example of long-term criminal survival, not because he was the most violent, but because he understood restraint. He avoided attention, he avoided excess, he avoided ego. These traits kept him alive longer than many others. But survival is not victory. René ended up with no community, no protection, and no future path. He did not die young, but he lived narrowly. His world shrank until it consisted only of memory and caution. Those who crossed paths with him remember different versions. Some remember a calm negotiator, others remember a cold presence. Some remember fairness, others remember fear. This contradiction defines him. René's story teaches a difficult lesson. Crime does not always end in dramatic downfall. Sometimes it ends in quiet erosion. Influence fades, connections vanish. What remains is a person alone with the consequences of earlier choices. In the end, René van H did not escape his past. He carried it with him every day. Every silence reminded him of what he could never say. Every quiet street reminded him of where he could never belong. His name remains in records, not as a hero or a villain, but as a warning. Power without transparency leads to isolation. Control without trust leads to emptiness. René van H survived longer than many, but survival alone was the price, and it cost him everything else. Even when René van H stopped appearing in public conversations, law enforcement never fully closed his file. In the Dutch justice system, some names are never erased. They are simply moved into long-term observation. René's was one of those names. Investigators believed that René represented a specific type of underworld figure, not a street-level criminal, not a loud leader, but a connector. People like that rarely leave fingerprints. They leave patterns. Police files described him as someone who knew where lines crossed, meaning he understood how money, violence, and influence flowed without directly touching them. Over the years, René's name appeared repeatedly in background intelligence reports, not as a primary suspect, but as a recurring presence. Phone numbers close to him showed up near other investigations. Addresses connected to him appeared in unrelated cases. Meetings happened where his name surfaced indirectly. None of it was enough for an arrest, but together it formed a picture. This frustrated investigators. Modern policing depends on evidence that can stand in court, not just knowledge. Officers often said, off record, that René was visible but untouchable. He had learned how to exist just outside the reach of prosecution. Police surveillance units tracked his routines for periods of time. What they found was not dramatic. René lived quietly. No obvious criminal activity, no visible cash movement, no loud associates. That was exactly what worried them. Experienced detectives know that the most dangerous criminals are often the calmest. René's discipline raised red flags. People who suddenly go silent after long involvement usually do so because they are hiding something or protecting someone else. At times, investigators considered that René might one day cooperate, but insiders doubted it. Men like René don't talk, not out of loyalty, but out of identity. Silence had become part of who he was. Breaking it would mean destroying the version of himself he had survived as. Police also feared that pressing him too hard might push others underground. René knew too many people. A wrong move could destabilize entire investigations. So they waited, watching, recording, updating files year after year. This waiting game defined the final phase of René's interaction with law enforcement. It was a quiet standoff. He did not provoke them. They did not corner him. Both sides understood the balance. In this way, René remained trapped between suspicion and freedom. Never charged, never cleared. His file stayed open, thick with notes, thin on proof.
Living under constant observation changes a person, even if that observation is subtle. René van H lived knowing that eyes might be on him, not always, but often enough to shape his behavior. This invisible pressure became part of his daily existence. He avoided patterns. He changed routines without explanation. He chose neutral locations. He spoke carefully, even with people he trusted. Psychologists explain that this kind of hyper-awareness slowly erodes a person's sense of safety. There is no relaxation, only management. René could not simply be himself. Every action felt like a signal that could be misinterpreted. A meeting could look like coordination. A phone call could look like planning. Even silence could be seen as strategy. This creates internal conflict. René wanted to disappear, but disappearing draws attention. He wanted to live quietly, but quiet looks suspicious. There was no winning move, only damage control. Those close to him noticed changes. He became more withdrawn. Conversations shortened. Humor disappeared. He listened more than he spoke. His body language showed tension even in calm environments. Experts describe this as long-term stress exposure. The body stays in alert mode too long. Sleep suffers. Decision-making becomes slower. Emotional expression shuts down. René showed all these signs. Despite this, he did not spiral. He did not self-destruct. That restraint, again, showed his discipline. But discipline does not erase strain. It only delays collapse. René had no safe place to unload thoughts. He could not speak to professionals with risk. He could not speak to friends without exposing them. He could not speak publicly without consequences. This is the unseen punishment of criminal life. Even without prison, the mind becomes a cage. Investigators later noted that men like René often age faster psychologically than physically. Their minds carry decades of unresolved tension. René's calm exterior hid constant calculation. In the end, the surveillance did not need to be aggressive. The awareness alone was enough to reshape his life. René van H's story does not end with a dramatic arrest or public trial. It ends the way many underworld stories do, quietly, unresolved, and incomplete. There was no final confession, no definitive verdict, no public reckoning. His name faded slowly from active investigations, replaced by newer targets and louder criminals, but it never fully disappeared. To law enforcement, René became a reference point, a case study. To criminals, he became a cautionary example. To the public, he remained largely unknown. This kind of ending confuses people. Society expects justice to be visible, but criminal history often closes without clarity. René existed in that gray space where certainty never arrives. His life demonstrates that crime does not always lead to immediate consequences. Sometimes it leads to a slow narrowing of existence, less freedom, less trust, less connection. René lived with the understanding that history was always behind him. He could not outrun it, only outlast it. That is not victory, it is endurance. What remains of René van H today are documents, memories, and unanswered questions. Files stored in archives, names mentioned quietly in interviews, stories told carefully. His legacy is not power or wealth. It is restraint taken too far, silence stretched
Too long, and a life shaped entirely by caution. In the end, René was neither celebrated nor condemned publicly. He simply existed, and then gradually disappeared from relevance. That, perhaps, is the truest cost of the path he chose. René van H's life was defined not just by what he did, but by the connections he maintained over decades. In the underworld, relationships are more powerful than money. They are currency, protection, and influence all in one. René understood this better than most. Even when he appeared to step back from active participation, people close to him knew he still had a network that stretched across cities and borders. Names like Willem Hollader, Klaas Bruinsma, and Cor van Hout often came up in conversations about operations he had once been connected to. These were men whose influence defined the Dutch underworld, and René had worked alongside, for, or around them in ways that law enforcement still struggled to fully trace. René's skill was in connecting without drawing attention to himself. He could introduce players, facilitate deals, or provide critical information without appearing in the room. These were invisible threads of control, and they made him invaluable to organized crime circles. Others often sought him out for his knowledge of the network, trusting that he would neither betray them nor overstep. Over time, this ability to maintain subtle influence became a survival mechanism. René rarely needed to use violence directly because he controlled outcomes by orchestrating people and events from the shadows. He understood that influence was stronger than force. A man who controls connections can redirect violence without lifting a hand. Yet, this web of relationships also created constant risk. Every person he helped, every connection he maintained, had the potential to pull him back into conflict. Police investigations would sometimes spike, not because René acted, but because someone connected to him did. Police notes often noted that contact with René van H often precedes significant underworld activity, showing that even absent action, his presence mattered. Maintaining these connections required discipline. René never allowed personal emotions to cloud judgment. He monitored everyone carefully, noting debts, loyalties, and vulnerabilities. He treated people as a part of a living map. Their movements, conversations, and decisions all became coordinates he could reference when necessary. This skill made him respected and feared. Criminals like Roy Adkins, Louis Hageman, and even younger Satudara members knew René's name carried weight. To cross him meant miscalculating a network that could isolate or neutralize you before you even realized the danger. In many ways, René became a living archive of Amsterdam's criminal history. His connections were not just tools, they were records of decades of alliances, betrayals, and survival. Even without direct action, René's network ensured he remained relevant, influential, and untouchable. A ghostly presence in a world driven by violence and visibility. René's reputation was built on silence, observation, and restraint. Unlike loud enforcers who thrived on intimidation, René's presence was subtle but always noticed. Those who met him once rarely forgot the encounter. His calm demeanor, quiet tone, and intense gaze created tension before he even spoke. Silence was his strategy. He rarely engaged in unnecessary conversation, preferring to watch and gather information. In criminal circles, this made him seem unpredictable and dangerous. If René said something, it carried weight because people knew he had observed, calculated, and decided it was worth mentioning. This approach gave him influence without exposure. Criminals, whether drug traffickers, enforcers, or middlemen, learned to respect René not through fear alone, but because of his precision. He could enforce debts, mediate conflicts, or coordinate operations without ever raising his voice. The results were always effective. Law enforcement, in contrast, found him maddening. Surveillance often revealed nothing overt. Meetings could be misinterpreted or missed entirely. Phone records alone were rarely sufficient to establish criminal involvement. Police notes frequently described him as seen but unprovable, a man whose reputation outpaced any concrete evidence. René's silent reputation also affected his allies. People saw his guidance, knowing that when René intervened, the matter would resolve without escalation. His presence alone could prevent violence. In disputes involving high-profile figures like Klaas Bruinsma, Roy Adkins, or members of the Hells Angels, René's judgment was quietly deferred to, sometimes without anyone explicitly acknowledging it. But silence carried its own burden. To be constantly observed while observing, to exert control without overt power, requires mental discipline.
René had to monitor his own behavior continuously, ensuring that no action could be misread or exploited. This self-control was exhausting but necessary. Ultimately, his reputation became a protective shield. The underworld learned that crossing René, or even underestimating him, was a mistake. Yet, for all his power, he rarely engaged in acts designed to build a name. Unlike other figures whose infamy came from violent displays, René's influence emerged organically from his control of information, connections, and strategy. By the time many younger criminals learned of him, the stories were already legendary. Tales of past influence, mysterious negotiations, and quiet yet decisive actions created a myth that reinforced reality. René van H was a man who could change outcomes without ever being seen to act. A reputation built on subtle mastery rather than spectacle. Every action René took came with consequences, sometimes visible, sometimes hidden. In the underworld, choices are rarely simple. Each decision affects multiple people, networks, and outcomes. René's life was a series of calculated choices, balancing risk, loyalty, and survival. He understood the cost of inaction as well as action. Letting a debt slide could signal weakness. Intervening too aggressively could provoke retaliation. Working within networks of criminals like Louis Hageman, Roy Adkins, and even younger Satudera members required careful calibration. Every interaction carried potential danger. René also knew that visibility increased vulnerability. Every phone call, meeting, and movement could be traced. Every association could be leveraged by rivals or law enforcement. This knowledge influenced the way he conducted business, often relying on intermediaries, coded language, and subtle influence rather than direct involvement. Even with such caution, René's choices sometimes led to unintended outcomes. Conflicts erupted between allies, minor mistakes escalated, and sometimes lives were lost indirectly because of his decisions. Unlike reckless actors, he bore these consequences silently, never seeking to justify or explain. The psychological weight of this constant calculation shaped him. It required constant awareness, patience, and a disciplined mind. Yet, it also gave him a clarity others lacked. He became a strategist, a mediator, and, when necessary, an invisible hand guiding events without ever appearing in the spotlight. In the end, René's story illustrates a truth about organized crime. Influence is more powerful than violence. Observation is more potent than rash action, and careful choice carries both power and burden. René van H chose a life that demanded constant calculation, and that choice defined him. Every day was measured, every interaction deliberate, and every outcome influenced by his understanding of human behavior, networks, and the fragile balance of power. His life shows that in the organized crime underworld, the greatest weapon is not a gun, but the mind.